It's November 7 and 8, 2024. What should have been an ordinary week in Amsterdam turned into a battlefield. I have already reported on what really happened just days after the event, and you can find a link to that very well received clip in the description below. Welcome back to SoulCube Analytics, where we challenge mainstream narratives and dive deep into global events. I am Thomas Karat, your host, presenting weekly insights from recognized thought leaders like diplomats, academics, intelligence experts, and sometimes activists of some sort. Today I will look into the part that global media played in turning this story virtually on its head, and I will give you some concrete and actionable tips that will enable you to look through the smoke and mirror that the mainstream media is selling you as facts. Now, the riots involving Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters, locals and protesters were splashed across the headlines worldwide.
First, the streets of Amsterdam. Vision reportedly showing Jewish soccer fans hunted like animals.
The Dutch have been shamed and shocked by Jew hunt by Muslims in the streets of Amsterdam.
Also, full coverage tonight of the Amsterdam pogrom.
But the story you saw wasn't the truth. It was something far more insidious. A carefully curated narrative designed to elicit your sympathy, redirect your anger, and obscure uncomfortable facts. And this wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated effort, and to understand why, we must unpack how global media frames events, manipulates language, and exploits human psychology. Let's start briefly with the footage. Original clips from Amsterdam showed Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters aggressively clashing with locals. These weren't innocent fans enjoying a match, they were hooligans chasing locals and creating havoc. Yet within hours, this footage was repurposed. Sky News, for example, initially reported on these provocations, citing eyewitnesses and raw footage. But then something changed. Sky News, in tandem with most other media outlets, reframed the very same footage with headlines declaring Israeli fans attacked in Amsterdam, pogrom in Amsterdam, and Israeli soccer fans ambushed by gangs of anti-Israel attackers. Across the board, from CNN to the New York Times, the story became one of anti-Semitic mobs targeting innocent Israeli football supporters. The aggression and racist slurs by the Maccabi supporters was erased, replaced with a narrative of victimhood. Here are some examples of linguistic manipulation in action. But if you want to learn more about how you can analyze global headlines, join me on Substack. A link is in the description below. So pay close attention to the headlines because they tell you something about the intent of the author. Amsterdam's mayor initially spoke of a pogrom in Amsterdam, which was readily picked up by the global media. Amsterdam descends into anti-Semitic chaos, came from CNN. Emergency evacuations for Israeli fans amid pogrom in Amsterdam, headlines of the BBC.
Because the Israeli military says it's preparing to immediately deploy a rescue mission to the Netherlands after violence broke out following a Europa League match between Maccabi Tel Aviv and Ajax Amsterdam.
Israeli fans fear for their lives, coming from the New York Times. Anti-Semitic attacks in Amsterdam, the Wall Street Journal. To her credit, while the mayor of Amsterdam initially spoke of a pogrom, meanwhile, she publicly voiced her regret for using this term. But words like pogrom are not chosen lightly. This term evokes harrowing imagery of historical massacres and prosecution. It immediately frames the events as targeted ethnic violence. But was it? Eyewitness accounts and uncensored footage reveal the opposite. The real aggressors, Israeli hooligans, were transformed into victims, a linguistic sleight of hand that virtually shaped global perception. But why does this work? Because language triggers emotional responses. Words like pogrom, mob, and fear for their lives activate primal fears, particularly in Western audiences conditioned to see Israelis as perpetual victims due to historical trauma. And then we have the New York Times leak. Leaked emails from the New York Times reveal just how deliberate this framing was. An investigative journalist submitted a piece exposing the Israeli hooligans' provocations, but the editors killed the story, citing concerns that it would fuel anti-Semitic sentiment. But this is how truth dies, not with censorship, but with justification disguised as sensitivity. What are the psychological drivers of media bias? Why do these narratives gain such traction? To understand this, we need to look at human psychology, particularly the mechanisms that drive our perception of conflict and victimhood, and I will give you 3 practical examples. First, the in-group, out-group bias. Humans are hardwired to categorize others into us versus them. This evolutionary trait, designed to protect against external threats, makes us susceptible to simplistic narratives. By portraying Israelis as victims and Palestinians or their perceived sympathizers as aggressors, media outlets tap into this binary thinking. It's easier for viewers to align with this familiar victim group than to question their role in the conflict. Second, moral credentializing. Media consumers feel morally validated when they support a group framed as victims. Reporting on the riots as anti-Semitic violence allowed audiences to reinforce their identity as defenders of justice, even when the evidence contradicts the narrative. And finally, availability heuristics. Repeated exposure to certain imagery and language cements the idea of threat. For decades, Western media has saturated audiences with imagery of Palestinians as aggressors and Israelis as victims. When riots occur, and because the human brain is lazy, audiences subconsciously rely on these mental shortcuts, these heuristics, accepting the familiar narrative without critical examination. Again, this happens subconsciously. The power to frame the narrative is the power to shape reality. Media outlets, whether intentionally or not, often decide how the public interprets events through their choice of words, imagery, and emphasis. Headlines, in particular, wield enormous influence. A neutral-sounding story can become a weaponized piece of propaganda with just a couple of tweaks. Let's have a look at how media headlines shape perception. These are some real-world examples. The Guardian reported, Israeli jets strike Gaza after rockets fired across the border. This implies the airstrike is a reactive measure to Palestinian aggression. By contrast, Al Jazeera framed a similar event as dozens killed in Israeli attack on northern Gaza, centering civilian casualties and highlighting Israeli military actions. These 2 headlines tell starkly different stories. One suggests justified defense, while the other highlights disproportionate force and humanitarian consequences. Neither is outright false, but the framing radically alters public perception. And we have visual framing too. A viral image from a BBC report showed Israeli children and women in a bomb shelter with the headline, "Parenting Under Fire." A similar incident was reported by Amnesty International under the headline, "Israeli attacks wipe out entire families in Gaza," depicting residents in a rubble after the Israeli attack. Both publications used imagery to evoke empathy, but for the opposing sides. These choices tap into the viewer's emotions, shaping how the conflict is understood and who is seen as the victim. This isn't just about semantics. In its essence, it's about psychological warfare. The language of riots versus uprisings, terrorists versus freedom fighters, or clashes versus massacres defines how audiences process events. More importantly, it determines whose story gets believed and whose voices are silenced. So why does the media do this? The answer lies in the broader geopolitical context. At the time of the riots, Israel faced mounting global criticism for its actions in Gaza. Civilian casualties and accusations of genocide and war crimes have eroded international support. By portraying the Israelis as the victims in Amsterdam, the media redirected the narrative. Sympathy for Israeli football fans spilled over into broader support for Israel's actions, painting the state as beleaguered and under siege even in Europe. And let's not forget, to control the narrative is to control history. We must ask ourselves, why this framing? Who benefits? Who suffers? Media literacy is no longer optional. It's survival in an age of weaponized narratives. If you control the narrative, you are controlling reality. Media doesn't just report. It constructs stories that shape perception, policy and memory, and they do so strategically and with purpose. Understanding the forces behind these narratives is crucial. I have prepared 5 practical explanations why the media is as it is for you. Explanations, not justifications. First, corporate media ownership. Global media is dominated by very few corporations, which prioritize shareholder interests over impartial reporting. Outlets like the BBC, the CNN and Fox News demonstrate how ownership shapes narrative. The BBC, for example, often reflects UK government interests, as seen clearly during the Iraq War when critical voices were sidelined in favor of state narrative about weapons of mass destruction. CNN, meanwhile owned by Warner Bros. Discovery, amplified pro-war perspectives during the Iraq War using military analysts with ties to defense contractors, whilst marginalizing anti-war viewpoints. And Fox News under Rupert Murdoch framed dissent as unpatriotic, aggressively pushing pro-war rhetoric aligned with the interests of defense advisors. Second, government and political influence. States shape narratives through funding, regulation or political media crossovers, such as George Stephanopoulos transiting from White House communication director to journalism in quotation. This is evident in Western media's framing of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which often reflects lobbying efforts and geopolitical alliances, casting one side as victims and the other as aggressor. Third, profit-driven sensationalism. Media's reliance on advertising and engagement fuels sensationalism over substance. Stories of protests often highlight property damage over underlying injustices, while coverage of climate change emphasizes catastrophes but downplays systemic causes like fossil fuel lobbying. Then we have cultural and ideological biases. Cultural narratives skew reporting, with Western media framing conflicts in non-Western regions as chaotic and interventions as moral. This double standard is especially visible in the sympathetic coverage of Ukraine compared to Israel's expansionist wars. And lastly, the invisible gatekeepers, the algorithms. Especially the last, say, 3 presidential elections in the US have exposed the extent of algorithmic control over public discourse. Social media platforms like X, formerly Twitter, Facebook and TikTok exhibited a clear pattern. They promoted narratives aligned with dominant ideologies while suppressing dissenting voices. Algorithmic shadow banning and similar techniques ensured that critical perspectives, particularly those questioning political elites and corporate influence, reached only a fraction of their potential audience. Meanwhile, content favoring establishment narratives was algorithmically amplified, completely saturating user feeds. So, as I hope to have demonstrated with these examples, media narratives are rarely neutral. Ownership, politics, profit, culture, and algorithms shape what we see and consequently what we believe. But you don't have to be a passive consumer of these narratives. Here are a couple of tips to help you to arm yourself against twisted media stories. First, and most importantly, examine the language. Look for emotionally charged words like pogrom, mob, or fear for their lives. Neutral reporting avoids such language. If you're interested in rhetorical manipulations in real life, I made a video using Nikki Haley's hate speech "Finish Them" as an example. The link is in the description below. What else can you do? Trace the sources. Who is quoted? Are the experts independent analysts? or government officials with agendas. Look for unedited footage. As we have seen with the Amsterdam Riots, edited clips can completely distort the context. Always look for the raw, unfiltered footage to understand events. And then compare coverage. Cross-check multiple outlets, especially independent ones, to identify inconsistencies. If there's one key concept for you as a takeaway from this clip, then it is the following. The Italians, probably because they are used to corrupt governments, capture a uniquely skeptical approach to political and media narratives with the term dietrismo. It comes from dietro, meaning behind. This concept embodies the belief that what is presented to the public is often designed to obscure deeper truth. Dietrismo frames the world as operating on two levels: the stage, where carefully crafted narratives are delivered, and the backstage, where the real motives and actions unfold, shielded from public scrutiny. A seasoned dietrista doesn't take narratives at face value. Instead, a dietrista interrogates them with questions like why I'm being told this, and more importantly, why now? This approach encourages a shift in your focus from the content of the message to its context, timing, and intent. Dietrismo offers us a powerful framework for resisting spin and propaganda. It challenges us to critically engage with what we see on TV, read in the news, or encounter on social media, urging us to question not just the information, but also the framing, motives, and timing behind it. In essence, dietrismo is more than skepticism. It is a defense mechanism against manipulation. It provides a lens to uncover hidden agendas and maintain intellectual autonomy. The Amsterdam Riots weren't just about football hooligans or local clashes. They were a case study in how global media manipulates perception to serve political agendas. The real tragedy isn't just the misrepresentation of the events, but the broader impact. A public manipulated into supporting injustices under the guise of compassion. The next time you see a breaking news story, don't just consume it. Analyze it like the Italians do with dietrismo. And as said before, if you want to learn more about how you can analyze global headlines, join me on Substack. It's free and you get unfiltered, in-depth analysis without the big tech algorithms and bias. A link is in the description below.